So what I've been doing is arguing that, sure, we can grant that maybe evil is less likely on austere theism than it is if God does not exist. Maybe we even grant that therefore, according to likelihoodism, evil is evidence against God existing. But it doesn't follow from likelihoodism that a further account of the evidence, our unawareness of a theodicy, is greater evidence for naturalism than for our typical religious beliefs. So a typical religious person can readily admit that there's some evidence against a logical consequence of his or her beliefs. But that was almost certainly true beforehand. You didn't need a problem of evil for that. I mean, that's not very profound. The theists can then point out that if we take a more complete description of our religious beliefs and the evidence concerning evil, the evidence may actually support religious beliefs over naturalism. Once you reject this standard view, the core assumption, the probabilistic framework, this evidential argument loses its appeal. Basically, the probabilities used in the standard view are irrelevant to whether religious belief is confirmed or disconfirmed by what we know about evil. And like I say, we'd get the same results if we use various Bayesian measures of evidential strength. So what I've done in this paper is I've tried to look at two common assumptions underlying discussions of evil and so forth in the philosophy of religion literature. And I think these should be rejected. They're not the type of assumptions we would make when we assess scientific theories or ordinary beliefs we hold. When we assess ordinary beliefs or scientific theory, we don't look at a small subset that's implied by the hypothesis. Another mistake I think we need to reject is we should not ignore the role that our hearts, our affections, our will, individual experience have when we form rational belief. Once you avoid these mistakes, it's very, very difficult to formulate any convincing problem of evil. And then I even talked about likelihoodism very quickly, just to show that a rational theist may even hold that the facts about evil are actually a problem for naturalism. So although it's very difficult to formulate any convincing philosophical problem of evil, I do think evil is a problem, and it should be a problem for typical religious believers. If contact with evil and our awareness of it and finding out about it doesn't affect us deeply, something's very wrong with us. There's terrible evil in the world, and the natural response is to be angry, shocked, depressed, and at times when we come into contact. If we don't, we're not really appreciating the magnitude of evil in the world. In other words, it's not admirable to use logical tricks to flippantly brush off the evil in the world. But this is not a philosophical problem that affects the rationality of religious belief. To answer the problems that arise from evil, a philosophical approach in which we try and use reason alone to assess certain evidence is not what is called for. And I think here the approach we find in Job is much more instructive. We can trust God and believe that God has a good reason while being horrified by the evil. So we can hope for the day in which good will overcome evil and evil will be no more. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And now Bas van Frazen will give a reply.
Well, I'm one of Plantinga's climbing grandchildren. Al taught Rick rock climbing, and Rick is my main teacher, rock climbing. So I'm a third generation Plantinga climber. They were hard taskmasters, I have to say that. They called me young, I was only 51, and took me to Yosemite. And well, during the first 2 years, there's a great difference between following and leading in rock climbing. And of course, I wasn't leading at that point. But I remember the day that I was following Rick on a place called Crest Jewel, where there's really nothing to hang on to. You just sort of have to balance and hope for the best. And he yells to me from above, "Buzz, see that helicopter flying way below us?" And I was saying, shut up, don't talk. So I was trying not to fall off. So when we came down, I said to Al and Rick, I'm never going to lead. The next morning, they took me to the rock, handed me the pro, and said, there's your first lead. Of course, we also always talk philosophy. Our discussions and our arguments have a logical conclusion. They end exactly at the bottom of the rock before we start climbing. But Al, well, he was teaching regularly a course called, a seminar called How to Be a Christian Philosopher. One year he told me that he was taking up some of my work. Of course, it was called How Not to Be a Christian Philosopher that year, as I understand. But anyway, let me try and comment on this paper by Rick. I owe both of them a lot. Commenting is a little bit difficult because I agree with so much of his critique. But I do want to raise a question for him, a question that does have me puzzled, and I think it's a question for Al too, perhaps. So you probably picked up the handout. Some of you picked up the handout outside. Don't read along with me. I'm not going to read. But the first page could act as a handout, as an outline, right? Rick focuses in the main part of his paper on two assumptions that he wants to criticize: the core assumption and the probabilistic assumption. I'm cutting them up into, I'm dividing them each of them into two parts. So when I say core assumption, I just mean the part that says to assess the bearing of evidence on a theory, it's appropriate to assess the bearing of that evidence on the core of the theory, on a very basic part of the theory. And the second part would be what I'll call the assessment principle, which is about how to assess it. And this is the principle that E is positive evidence for a hypothesis exactly if E raises the probability of that hypothesis. If the probability of the hypothesis conditioned on the evidence is higher than the probability of the hypothesis itself. Now, Rick is not criticizing that part. He's taking it on, and I don't know whether in the end he would want to advocate it, but I take it that it is a standard part of the literature that he's criticizing. Right? The probabilistic assumption, I also want to divide into two parts. What I'll call the probabilistic assumption itself is just that the probabilities are objective, that they are logical probabilities accessible by reason alone. And then the second part I'll call the rationality principle, which is that the rationality of holding a belief is highly dependent on the assessment of the bearing of evidence in accordance with the above. Right? And I'll take these up in turn. Now, very first point I would want to make is that when I was thinking about how some of the people who criticize this might react, how I would respond if I was in that position, I would think that I would immediately go for the assessment principle. Because the core assumption and the assessment principle together, they are really in tension with each other, very much so. Because if you think of the relationship, the probability of the hypothesis given the evidence is greater than the probability of the hypothesis alone. Okay? That's extremely sensitive to what you might add to the hypothesis and the evidence. In fact, that relationship can turn upside down. It's unpredictable what will happen in a general way if either you add something to a hypothesis or if you add a bit of evidence. So that there's a confirmation of the core is simply just irrelevant to any practical questions about, by this standard of confirmation, the confirmation of the theory. And similarly for this confirmation. So of course, this is a rather abstract point, but Rick makes the point very concrete with certain examples. So I do think that if I were one of the targets, I would immediately think, okay, well, these two things just don't go together, and I would go after the assessment principle. Right? And you can do that in various ways. One thing you might say that this relationship is perhaps a bit too simplistic, and look for other, say, Bayesian measures of confirmation. But actually, in this particular respect, they all would have the same problem. They would all raise the same problem, at least the ones that I know. And as a matter of fact,